Welcome, everybody, on May 1st to this absolutely amazing webinar. I already started the interpretation, explanation. If you need interpretation, then please select the language that you need at the bottom of your screen. We welcome very much to this exciting webinar that we co-organized with Debt Justice, that is also represented by Tess today, who's doing tech and background work. Thanks a lot for your help in this. Debt Justice, Debt Justice is a campaigning organization working with other groups to end unjust debt and the poverty and inequality it perpetuates in the UK and across the world. So big thanks for that. Also, big thanks to the interpreters who are making this webinar possible today and who will interpret everything that is being said so that everybody can understand and listen to that. The webinar is being recorded. We can also stop the recording at the Q&A, but we will upload it afterwards on YouTube so that everybody will have access to it. So if you miss any section, any part of it, don't worry, we will upload it onto our YouTube channel and you can listen into. I am happy to introduce myself as well. I will be the facilitator of the webinar today, and I am part of the global coordination team of Debt for Climate. My name is Louise, and I very, very much look forward to this very exciting discussion that we will be having today. And I just, before I will hand it over to the speakers, I just want to take about 5 minutes to give you a bit of a contextualization as to why we're actually organizing this entire webinar that is called the Radical Reimagining of Economics from the Global South, the new international economic order for the 21st century. First I start by saying who we actually are, in case you don't know this yet. We are Debt for Climate, a global grassroots movement initiated and led by people from the Global South. And since December last year, we can also proudly say that we are a women-led movement and just recently had a powerful international day of action against the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank in this important year as it is their 80th anniversary. So we at Debt for Climate have put a lot of energy efforts in the past 2.5 years into really hammering down and nailing our demand for debt cancellation into everybody's head as a precondition for true climate justice, self-determination for the Global South, and a just transition away from fossil fuel extractivism. Sorry, I have to interrupt myself speaking sometimes because I have to let people come into the meeting as well. We have shown the connections between the indebtedness of the Global South and colonialism, deforestation, human rights violations, land grabbing from indigenous nations, fossil fuel extraction, hunger, poverty, and also the crackdown on the working class. And we have done so both on the streets and in marches, in direct actions, but as well in wonderful panel discussions and online campaigns. And although this sounds like it's quite a lot, and it is, we have, for strategic reasons, kept our demand quite narrow and on point. So total and unconditional debt cancellation for the Global South, so that we can take on this massive topic one step at a time. While doing this, we have often encountered this question of, but is debt cancellation enough? What will happen to the credit rating of the Global South? What if they lose access to the financial market? And these kind of questions. And this is where this webinar comes in as a preliminary answer to all of these questions. So debt cancellation itself is not a silver bullet to all the problems in the world. It is a very, very powerful demand that has cost people their lives. If you remember what happened to Thomas Sankara, who was assassinated in 1987 after he demanded a united front for debt cancellation. But in order for it to really lead to true liberation and self-determination and a just transition away from extractivism, it needs to be embedded into a larger systematic transformation of finance and economics. And so this webinar is introducing a next phase, and I want to welcome you all. I'm glad to share it with you all, our next phase of our campaigning, where we will look at radical proposals from the Global South that have thought to break with toxic and exploitative colonial relations in the guise of economics and finance, and that are no less powerful, because the new international economic order that we will discuss today has actually led to the creation of the G7. So the new international economic order is celebrating its 50th anniversary today. Obviously, today is also May Day, so I want to wish you all solidarity on this very important day for these two reasons. And we will look at the core message or messages of the new international economic order, its weak points, and also what needs to happen for it to be finally implemented. And we will learn key lessons as to what is needed for a revival of the NIEO, and so that cancellation can receive its broader framework that it needs, so that it can operate as the great liberation force that it potentially has. Just letting in our interpreter. And so with that, I want to give the word to our first speaker, Bhumika Muchhala, who is a senior advisor and political economist at the Third World Network. And the question for you would be whether you could give us a brief overview of the historical context of the emergence of the NIEO, its significance for the time, maybe its main goals, and also its main shortcomings. So thank you so much for being with us and giving your insight. Much appreciated. And the floor is yours. I will time keep you for the next 10 minutes.
Hi, hello. I hope you can hear me well. Thank you to Louise and Tess for organizing this very critical event today. For the past year or two, there has been there have been a lot of events around marking the 50th anniversary of the new international economic order. And given the polycrises in our world today and the intensification of our climate emergency, there could be no better time to really invoke the potential, the possibility, the imagination, the bold proposals, the structuralism of the new international economic order than today. So I'm happy to contribute an overview of the origins of the NIEO. So I would start with laying out the context. The context is 1972, where in Chile, in Santiago, at the third UNCTAD conference, the new international economic order was advanced as a set of proposals by the G77 at that time, by the developing country bloc. The ethos was addressing economic colonialism and structural independency through a new interdependent economic order. So the NIEO is, in essence, its origins are an anti-colonial world-making project that emerged from the experiences of decolonization after the Second World War, where leaders and thinkers of new nations developed a key position, and that was this: although anti-colonial freedom struggles achieved political independence, turning former colonies into new nations, a shared analysis emerged that their de jure political colonization ended only to be replaced by a de facto economic colonization. This shared standpoint sought to destabilize the post-war international order led by former colonizers. Ghanaian President Kwame Nkrumah wrote at the time that the abdication of colonial administration annihilated the need for even an empty performance of accountability. Neocolonialism, Nkrumah argued, was, quote unquote, the worst form of imperialism. For those who practice it, it means power without responsibility. And for those who suffer from it, it means exploitation without redress. In the critical time between 1972 and 1974, in just these 3 years, global South nations came together repeatedly in what has been called a trade union of the poor nations, who wielded state sovereignty as both shield and sword. They galvanized the forum of the UN General Assembly to pass resolutions on a new international economic order and a charter of the economic rights and duties of states in 1974, which stated that vestiges of alien and colonial domination, foreign occupation, racial discrimination, apartheid, and neocolonialism continue to reproduce inequality after independence. And it is important to note that this charter included clear language on the occupation and apartheid of Israel in Palestine, as well as South Africa. So this ethos of the non-aligned movement was already taking shape and connecting the political to the economic. So the key themes were sovereign equality, international redistribution, the democratization of decision-making by explicitly increasing the bargaining power of the South and their right to self-determination, particularly over natural resources and land. The principles of the NIEO included specifically equity to combat systemic inequality, interdependence to tackle hierarchical dependence, intergovernmental cooperation to address unilateral coercion and sanctions, and solidarity among all states in counter-response to the power plays in the international arena. Overcoming dependence was imagined as possible only in the context of equalized political and economic power. What is important here is the reformulation of sovereign equality in a radical way for that time. Sovereign equality wasn't as simple as merely the statehood. It was also a demand for an equitable share of the world's wealth, which was identified as derived from the past to present colonial legacy of plunder, theft, and systematic wealth and resource drain from former colonies. This is a key point because this is a reparative recasting of sovereign equality, which was envisioned as the economic component of the political definition of sovereignty. As Adam Gerachew says in her book, World Making After Empire, the view that sovereign equality had material implications marked anti-colonial nationalists' biggest departure from the post-war international legal order, and it was then also quickly weaponized, rejected, and displaced in the neoliberal counter-revolution that followed immediately after of the Reagan-Thatcher turn to neoliberalism. Also, an important element of the new international economic order, which has been lost in recent decades, was the analysis that colonial domination created an internationalized racial hierarchy that structures the global economic order, thus connecting racial hierarchy to the economic order. And that decolonization involves a multiplicity of political projects that lead to global justice. So another key theme that emerged was that which questioned the very entity of the nation state as a post-colonial construction. It was said that C.L.R. Williams and others had proposed centralized federal states to in response to the arbitrary and divisive features of colonial rule in the post-colonial state construction. In this sense, the anti-colonial world making of the NIEO is also about dispersing and delegating sovereignty beyond the nation state. The key economic components, I want to turn to that. The key economic components of the NIEO was centered on the notion of declining terms of trade. This was a shared phenomenon afflicting almost all newly independent states and arguably still affecting the vast majority of the global South. And this was the driving force or the fuel that really drove the formation of the NIEO project. According to Julio Linares, former president of Tanzania, declining terms of trade meant that however great our efforts to reorganize our national economies so that they produce the goods our people need and to ensure these goods are distributed less unequally, third world countries are and will be continually generating poverty. Post-colonial states were working to create justice in an international sieve of drain, as the structural inequalities of the global economy consistently undermine efforts to achieve domestic equality. Terms of trade was a concept first really proposed by the Argentine economist Raul Prebisch. He was the head of the Economic Commission for Latin America, ECLAC, from the late 1940s, and then the founding Secretary General of UNCTAD from the early 1960s. Along with German-British economist Hans Singer, the Prebisch-Singer or the Singer-Prebisch thesis was essentially that absent regulatory intervention, the terms of trade between primary commodity producers and manufacturers deteriorate over time. This was a political critique of the subordinate economic position to which the imperial powers had historically consigned colonies as primary producers of natural resources and commodities through extractivism, plantations, mining, etc. So this terms of trade hypothesis was a political framework as well that offered a clear path forward. International trade needed and still needs to be managed to prevent the deterioration of the terms of trade, and governments and corporations from the North had to be compelled and regulated to provide capital, technology, to enable the South to develop its own industrial base by, first of all, preventing the blocking of industrial and a diversification of the production structures of developing countries. So this is what laid the foundation for then.
I have to interrupt you for 1 second, Bhumika, because we have about 1 minute left, and
okay,
then
I'll wrap up.
Great, thank you.
Yes. So just to, continue that this was really what laid the foundation for dependency theories and world system theories, in that global South economies were systematically disarticulated into low value added and dependent modes of commodity and raw material production. So there were really concrete demands of the NIEO. And I just want to go through some of the demands that were so bold and demanding for not just key policy space, but this was something more. This was something about restructuring the global economic order that went far beyond financial architecture and regulation, but really addressing production, trade, and the organization of the world economy. So some of the demands were to restructure international trade, a new commodity order through international commodity agreements, and specifically a common fund for commodity price stabilization. There was a coherent call throughout for global redistribution, particularly finance, resource, and technology transfer, permanent sovereignty over natural resources, importantly, greater regulation of transnational corporations. So this wasn't just about the developmental role of the state to govern the market, but this was something more concrete, to regulate the market through legislation, in particular antitrust enforcement. It was also about reforming the rich country-led Bretton Woods institutions, particularly voice and vote in decision-making, still ongoing. You can see how so many of these demands are still the demands of the South. Specifically, also empowering the UN General Assembly as a legislative body for making binding international law, which was then very systematically scuttled by the United States by turning the Security Council as the primary forum and the OECD and IMF for economic decision-making. It also addressed currency hierarchy and the fact that debt creation was systematically rooted in the absence of monetary sovereignty. It addressed unilateral sanctions to enforce North policy agendas. And most of all, it was a program for global socialism and solidifying third worldism, or the vision of solidarity among poor nations. So this was a mix of economic, political, systemic, legal, and political vision. It was courageous, and it sought to redress historical grievances of newly independent states in order to precisely complete decolonization. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bhumika. That was very, very, very rich already. And I'm looking forward already to your next 5 minutes, where you can elaborate more on some of these points. Also for everybody to know, we are recording the webinar and we will upload it to our YouTube channel afterwards. We just shared the link to our YouTube channel in the chat. Thank you, Bhumika, already for that very good overview of what the historical context of the NIEO was about and some of its core ideas. And with that, I want to come to our next speaker, Swasthika Arulingam, who is the president of the United Federation of Labour and Attorney of Law in Sri Lanka. And for you, also thank you very much for you to be here after your great work on the streets today on this very important day for social justice. And for you, I would like you to tell us a little about the effects that has on the working class in your political context, and how also you're organizing resistance against it, and what are your key insights and learnings from the new international economic order and its revival for the 21st century. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Louise. First of all, happy International Revolutionary Workers' May Day to all. In Sri Lanka, it was very historic because thousands of workers turned up on the streets, representing unions and mass organizations. Workers and farmers and fishers, not affiliated to any political parties, turned up on the streets today to demand for a better country, a better Sri Lanka, better life for the working class of Sri Lanka. So it was indeed a historic moment today. And the topic today, which we asked to present, is very important and historical, particularly in the context of what we're experiencing in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was declared bankrupt in April 2022. And since then, the working class, the entire crisis, the entire economic crisis, the consequence of that economic crisis or the implications of that economic crisis has been put on the working class of Sri Lanka. Also because of the interventions of organizations like the International Monetary Fund. And when I was listening to Bhumika speaking, one of the things which was really telling is that almost 4 or 5 decades ago, third world nations came together and reimagined an economic order. They reimagined an economic order against economic colonization, the democratization of economic order, an overhaul of the rules of trade, a reform of the international monetary system. These are the things which were imagined and were demanded for by third world states decades ago. But we come in full circles where today, if you take Sri Lanka as an example, and Sri Lanka is just one country, but if you take Sri Lanka as an example, the International Monetary Fund, after many years of intervening into various third world countries, today they're proposing the same mantra to Sri Lanka, which has failed in so many other countries. Privatization, austerity, deregulation, financial deregulation. These are the things which the IMF is proposing to Sri Lanka in order to come out of an economic crisis, which, mind you, was not in any way the fault of the workers of Sri Lanka. So if you look at the debt situation in Sri Lanka, we need to pay back a debt. And in order to do that, the prescription which has been put on the working people is more taxation. The prescription which has been put on Sri Lankan people is we have been asked to privatize our state-owned enterprises like telecom, like electricity, like insurance, and so on. And these state-owned enterprises have been vital in contributing to a welfare state which so many of our working class has relied on. For instance, Sri Lanka has used to have 98% literacy rate, used to have. But the government is today proposing a new education policy which would completely set aside the free education, the right to free education, and the access to free education, which Sri Lankan workers used to have until this year. So I can go on. 65% of the working class is food insecure today. But if you look at the proposals which has been put by the IMF, and if you look at the proposals which are being imposed on the people, it is almost as if the working class has been gaslighted for the fault of a country going into debt because of the corruption of the elite. So to give a very specific example, the Labour Minister is coming up with a labour law reform, which is taking away, on May Day, it is taking away the 8-hour workday protection, which in 1886, workers in Chicago fought for, and workers died for this. And this 8-hour workday is today proposed to be dismantled through a labour reform and regulation. So this is where we are standing today in terms of the debt. This is where we are standing in terms of the prescriptions which have been proposed by the IMF and various states. Our state resources are being sold off to multinational companies, multinational Indian companies like Adani. If you take the north and east seas of Sri Lanka, the seas and the resources are being sold off so that our fishers came to Colombo all the way from the northern part of the country to demand that their sea resources be protected for themselves. Same with farmers and so on. So how is the working class in Sri Lanka fighting against this austerization? How are we fighting? We have been coming together. There has been a division, historic division between peasants and workers. But because of the economic crisis has been used as a moment for workers and peasants and fishers to come together into a common platform and demand for certain things. For instance, if you take the privatization campaign, telecom workers and insurance workers have been struggling. And for those struggles, the farmers and fishers also have brought in their solidarity and their numbers and so on. If you take an example of another struggle, the IMF informed the government or demanded the government that if we have to have any kind of debt restructuring internationally, then you need to restructure your local debt as well. So what did the Sri Lankan government do? The Sri Lankan government went to the statutory savings of the workers, the EPF, the statutory savings of the workers, and it used the statutory savings. It used the statutory savings to set aside a part of the domestic debt, and it called itself the restructuring of the domestic debt. But for the purpose of the restructuring, only the statutory savings of the workers were used. No private bondholders were touched. No private bondholders and the wealth they were invested has been touched by the government. Same with taxation. Workers are being taxed on their income, but we have been demanding for a wealth tax, but the government has not imposed a wealth tax. So we have been demanding and protesting on the streets and speaking with the government and pressuring the parliament to set aside this draconian taxation and instead tax people who are able to pay the taxation without much impact on their in their lives and so on. So I want to go back to the new international economic order, which was imagined. We imagined a different world order. We imagined a more equitable world order, and we imagined a South-to-South solidarity. This has become it has become almost a huge challenge, I would say, particularly in the context of countries like India, who are using the unequal economic structures to, I would say, neo-colonize countries like Sri Lanka, take over lands of working people instead of forming solidarity, instead of helping Sri Lanka to come out of this crisis. So unfortunately, things have turned almost 180 degrees. But one of the things which the Sri Lankan working class is doing is we are starting to recognize that this is not a local struggle. We need to work together with Indian workers. We need to work together with Palestinian workers. Today, a genocide is happening in Palestine, and the Sri Lankan government is sending Sri Lankan workers to fill the vacancies which of the Palestinian workers who have been denied working permits in Israel. So the Sri Lankan government is standing with or showing its solidarity to a country which is committing genocide on the Palestinian people. And the workers today at the May Day and for the last several months have been holding slogans against the genocide which is happening in Palestine, and have been demanding from the Sri Lankan government to not pit workers against workers, to not send Sri Lankan workers to fill the vacancies formed by the Palestinian or caused by the Israeli state on the Palestinian workers. So this is what we have been doing. Our struggle is not only local, it is also international. And we are hoping that Sri Lanka, of course, is a small country. We're a small economy. Our working population is around 8 million. But we are hoping that when we struggle for debt justice, when we struggle to come out of this debt crisis, the 56 other states which are also in a state of debt distress will join our struggle. And it would become an international struggle against odious debt. It would become an international struggle against unfair debt structures, which are constantly keeping third world countries like Sri Lanka in a state of debt and a state of continuous dependence, which is what the new international economic order imagined against. Thank you, Louise.
Wow, this was on point. You had 9 seconds left. Thanks a lot. This was a very, very powerful speech as well, Swastika, and I think it really exemplified, right, how debt is such a unifying force to bring together different movements and to bridge differences between movements, as you have said, between peasants and farmers. So it's really great to hear that, and very much appreciate the work that you were between peasants and workers was what I was wanting to say. Thank you so much for bringing that into it, and we all stand in solidarity with you, and let's keep up the fight, because this is exactly what we are trying also to do with Debt for Climate, to unify movements to fight for debt cancellation in a way that it will bring true liberation for all peoples, also for the Palestinian people, obviously. Because we also have seen in this case how debt is being used to put pressure on Egypt, right, to encourage basically, or to support the genocide that is going on through debt and or the offer of debt restructuring. So thanks for uniting all of these topics. Was very powerful. And I'm going to come to our next and last speaker for today, Julio Linares. Julio is an economic anthropologist from the territories known today as Guatemala. He's part of the anti-colonial migrant movement in Berlin in Germany, and also of Debt for Climate. And since 2018, he has served as a public outreach for the Basic Income Earth Network, and he's currently writing on a super interesting book, his first book, that is titled Decolonizing Money, on the Abolition of the US Dollar, also very, very timely. So thank you for joining us today, Julio. And what I would like to know from you is, what do you think needs to happen to the Bretton Woods institutions that we already heard from, right? So the IMF and the World Bank, and you're also writing in your book about in a NIEO 2.0. What alternatives to them do you see? And what would a NIEO 2.0 also need to say about debt, right, in order to break the chains of financial colonialism that are still being upheld through debt? And what, in your view, does the decolonization of money really look like? So the floor is yours, and I'm very much looking forward to your input.
Muchas gracias. Voy a hablar en español. ¿Está bien? Sí. Bueno, muchas gracias a Luis, a la Deuda por el Clima, a todas, a todos, a Bhumika, a Swasthika. Muchas gracias por sus intervenciones. Bueno, para responder la pregunta, creo que lo más directo que se puede decir es que estas instituciones de los Bretton Woods hay que abolirlas completamente, incondicionalmente. Me refiero al Fondo Monetario Internacional, pero creo que ir un poco más con otras instituciones también. Cuando en Estados Unidos se abolió la esclavitud, el sociólogo W.E.B. Du Bois escribió un libro sobre lo que se llama la democracia de la abolición. Y lo que esto quiere decir es que cuando la abolición de la esclavitud se dio, no hubieron instituciones democráticas para que las personas que habían sido liberadas de la esclavitud pudieran entrar en la economía de ese momento, ¿no? Entonces, de ser esclavos se transformaron en trabajadores asalariados con condiciones muy precarizadas, de las cuales todavía el legado se vive hoy en día. Ya, entonces, con esta idea que hoy en día toma gente como Angela Davis y Ruth Wilmore Gibson en Estados Unidos, la pregunta es cómo podemos crear instituciones democráticas contra instituciones democráticas que puedan, no solo una vez que abulamos estas instituciones, la pregunta es qué tipo de instituciones vamos a crear para poder manejar el tema de la deuda, ¿no? Mi propuesta concreta en esto es que se cree un club de deudores, una confederación de deudores, que es básicamente la propuesta de Tomás Sankara. Tomás Sankara le llamó a este club el Club de los Deudores, el Debtors Club, o también el Addis Ababa Club, que fue la ciudad en Etiopía en donde la conferencia en donde él estaba hablando se dio, ¿no? Entonces, para responder la pregunta concretamente, la abolición de las instituciones monetarias de Estados Unidos, en este caso el Fondo Monetario, el Banco Mundial, pero también la creación de instituciones democráticas que sea controlada por todos los países en el mundo de una forma egalitaria, con esta idea de la soberanía como egalitaria, como decía mis compañeras. La otra cosa es que, como digo también en el libro, es que no, la forma más directa de abolir la deuda hoy en día es por medio de la abolición del dólar gringo, el dólar estadounidense. ¿Por qué? Porque la mayoría de las deudas que hoy en día los países del sur global tienen que pagarle al Fondo Monetario, al Banco Mundial, estas deudas se pagan en dólares. Los bancos centrales de todos los países del mundo hoy en día están atados a tener que tener dólares en sus reservas, así también como las notas de la tesorería de Estados Unidos, que son básicamente promesas de más dólares a futuro, para poder estabilizar el poder de su propia economía y el poder de su propia moneda. Entonces, la jerarquía monetaria de la que hablaba antes mi compañera se basa en un sistema en el cual el dólar estadounidense es el soberano de todo el mundo, en el sentido de que todas las monedas solo pueden ser transformadas al dólar como una forma de hegemonía y superimperialismo. Ahora, esto es muy importante porque si no abolimos el dólar, no vamos a poder transformar las relaciones de interdependencia que ya existen entre los países del mundo y no vamos a poder salir, digamos, del imaginario imperialista colonial capitalista en el que estamos hoy en día, tanto a nivel político como a nivel económico. Entonces, la abolición del dólar en sí mismo sería un jubileo de la deuda, probablemente el más grande que hemos visto en la historia, o comparado, por ejemplo, con los jubileos antiguos en Sumeria y Mesopotamia, en el sentido de que de un día para otro, naciones enteras, países enteros, personas enteras, podrían tomar el ingreso que es suyo. Países hoy en día tienen que pagar 25-50% de su ingreso nacional a estas instituciones coloniales imperialistas como el Fondo Monetario y el Banco Mundial. Entonces, la cancelación de la deuda en ese sentido es la base del NIEO 2.0. No podemos transicionar a otro sistema a menos de que no cancelemos las relaciones monetarias que tenemos hoy en día y luego empezar otras, ¿no? El dinero es una forma de deuda y las deudas son promesas que nosotros como personas nos hacemos los unos a los otros. Ahora la pregunta es, ¿qué tipo de promesas libres podremos hacer entre personas, entre grupos, entre naciones enteras, sin el colonialismo de la deuda que hoy en día se impone por medio del dólar americano? Em, lo último que quiero decir también es que en relación al genocidio que está pasando hoy en día en Palestina, es que el régimen de Estados Unidos se basa en el sistema del petrodólar, que quiere decir que hoy en día solo se puede pagar por petróleo en dólares. Y ese sistema está impuesto por la fuerza y la violencia del ejército gringo, el ejército estadounidense, que a la vez, por medio de la producción de armas, o sea, y por medio de su consumo también de, 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 de- de petróleo, pues es uno de los polucionistas más grandes del mundo. Y a la vez, por medio de esas armas, es que se mantiene su régimen y por medio de su venta a países como Israel, a los estados como Israel, para mantener su régimen económico colonial. Entonces, no puede haber una Palestina libre si no hay una cancelación total del dólar, una abolición total del dólar y la cancelación de las deudas que el dólar mantiene por medio de la violencia del Estado americano. Entonces, solo para traerlo a una conclusión y, y hacer un resumen, em, lo que, lo que tenemos que tomar en cuenta es que hoy en día, si no abolimos el dólar nos va a destruir. ¿Por qué? Porque las instituciones como la Reserva Federal y la Tesorería Americana son las que son responsables de la emisión del dólar, crean más deuda todos los años sin ningún límite, lo que se transforma en extractivismo en términos de tanto materia prima, minerales, pero también mercancías, y también se transforma en deuda a nivel personal, a nivel comercial, y es una deuda que no se puede pagar, ¿no? Entonces, es importante también decir que la liberación de los pueblos tiene que ser autodeterminada. Por lo mismo, este tipo de instituciones democráticas tienen que ser democráticas a nivel directo. No puede ser una democracia representativa burguesa, tiene que venir desde los movimientos sociales y tiene que venir también desde las demandas de los pueblos. Pero la precondición para poder salir del régimen de deuda colonial en el que estamos, en mi análisis, necesita la abolición del dólar. Y bueno, en complementación para el NIEO 2.0, la cancelación de deuda debería ser la base, en el sentido de que cada ciertos años debería haber una cancelación periódica de la deuda. Y a su vez, en complementación, debería también haber un sistema de ingreso incondicional universal para todas las personas en el planeta. De esta forma, podemos transicionar a un sistema en el cual la gente ya no será atada bajo la sumisión de la deuda, tanto como del trabajo asalariado, que son las dos formas en las cuales hoy en día el sistema capitalista nos mantiene sin libertad y también extrae, digamos, nuestra capacidad de poder regenerar la vida. Entonces, todas las personas que estamos luchando por la vida, tenemos que luchar por el fin del imperio eh, materializado en el dólar estadounidense.
Thanks a lot.
I,
Perfect, Julio. Thank you so much for that synthesis. And all of you make the job of a timekeeper today very easy. You are very much on point. So thank you for that effort from your side. And I think you mentioned also something that is very, very important to not forget the debts that cannot be paid. Also reminding people that these debts, these loans were designed so that they cannot be paid, because you need this access to cheap labor force. You need the access to the resources after the direct colonial rule. And so this is really the question of that we need to turn the tables also in a NIEO 2.0, to turn the tables on this question of who owes who really, and to historicize the debt, and not to just to analyze it in a vacuum, but really to historicize it. Where do they come from, and what purpose did they serve, and to remind ourselves that most of them are just completely illegitimate because it's just a tool of power. So thank you for raising that as well, and your great synthesis. And we are very good on time. And I want to give everybody not everybody everybody from our speakers the opportunity to have like a 5-minute wrap up of the key takeaways that you would say a NIEO 2.0 that is up to the challenges of the 21st century needs to have this. So I'm going to maybe go into reverse order this time. So I'm going to start with Julio, go back to Swastika, and then go to Bhumika, if that's okay. And yeah, so just take about 5 minutes to summarize a bit what you would see the NIEO 2.0 that really needs to cover. I know you already said some about it, but just as a recap of your thoughts.
Maybe I say this part in English, if it's okay. And so I would say that the basis of the NIEO 2.0 has to have debt cancellation as its basis, so that unequal exchange does not arise between nations anymore. Then the second thing I said is this idea of an unconditional income for all of humanity. I would call it a liberatory income, in the sense that it releases people from the compulsion for forced labor for a wage. If we can do this, then we can really have a just transition. I mentioned the abolition of the dollar because also of the relationship to the energy matrix, to petrol and fossil fuels. So we also need to develop a monetary system which reflects the relationships of trade, the terms of trade, the bilateral and multilateral relationships of trade that people have, and not colonial tax impositions that the US may put on countries arbitrarily. So I think this is very important. I would argue for these changes as the democratization of monetary destruction in the form of debt cancellation, and the democratization of monetary creation in the form of an unconditional income. This power is today apolitical. Central banks in the world have political independence from the rest of the state political apparatus, and this is something that we need to change. We need to drastically politicize the power over monetary creation, over debt, and its destruction, which today only banks do. And so this is something that I think is at the core. of what a NIEO 2.0 has to have. And something that I forgot to mention before is that it was in 1971 when President Nixon at the time of the US unpegged the dollar from gold, from the gold standard. And they did this because at the time they were struggling to pay for the war in Vietnam. And so in order to pay for its balance of payments deficit, the US basically became the de facto unit of account as a currency for the rest of the world, which means that all debts have to be accounted for in the US dollar. So this paradigm where we price things always in relationship to the dollar has to change, because otherwise this is exactly the mechanism through which the extractivism happens. So yeah.
Thank you. Great synthesis, very on point. And then I'll give Swastika the opportunity to do her summary. Please go ahead.
I couldn't agree more with what Julio said. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I completely agree with what you said, and I want to second it, because what I would imagine as a 2.0 NIEO is not very different to what you just said. I want to, in addition to tying it to wages and debt cancellation, I also, learning from the experience of Sri Lanka, I also want to speak about how do we imagine this debt cancellation? Where do we start about this debt cancellation? And we have been demanding something called a debt audit in Sri Lanka to identify which of it actually benefited the people of Sri Lanka, which of it was odious debt and debt which was predatory, which we are being forced to pay. So a debt audit is something which we are demanding from Sri Lanka. The other thing, of course, is we also have to look into a new economic order should also look into the contribution of IMF, World Bank, and their policies, which contribute to the continuous indebtedness of third world state. And we have been speaking about this, but we have not come up with a structure to really understand globally what these organizations have done to continue their dominance of the global north versus the global south. So in Sri Lanka, we are demanding, because Sri Lanka has been going through 16 IMF packages, how much of this IMF policies have directly contributed to the indebtedness of Sri Lanka is something which we are looking into. So a relook at this is what was asked back in the 70s also, but we want to relook what the international financial structures and orders have done to continue to maintain the imbalance between countries. And the third specific thing is, once again, learning from the experience of Sri Lanka, is that no matter how much a country is indebted, our natural resources and our resources cannot be taken away, our people cannot be deprived of from our natural resources. Our farmers, our fishers, our workers cannot be deprived of our natural resources. Once again, this is what the new international economic order was looking into, the control of our natural resources. But we have completely forgotten this, and third world states are wholesale selling assets to private companies for exploitation. So once again, we are looking at this issue that no matter how much a country is indebted, you cannot force a country to sell its resources to the detriment of its people. And the interesting thing is, we're always looking at it as if it's a complicated thing, it's not a possible thing. But in Sri Lanka, we have a very similar law. And I want to take this example because that is where it's a very small thing. The Sri Lankan microfinance structures, we have a huge microfinance problem in Sri Lanka, where microfinance loans have indebted the working people. But one of the things which microfinance loans do or protect people from is the deprivation of immovable assets. So you can't remove land from a person if you're indebted through a microfinance loan. And I want to transfer that learning to global structures, debt structures also. And you cannot deprive the local people, the people who are living on the land, the people who are benefiting, who are depending on their livelihoods on that land in order to pay back debt, which is what is happening in third world countries. So I want to specifically put that issue because that is directly connected to climate justice. The more you sell resources for private exploitation, the less likely you are going to get anywhere in terms of climate justice. So the last point is particularly specific. I want to specifically put that because it is directly connected to climate justice and what we are imagining in terms of a sustainable future that is directly connected to that. Thank you.
Thanks. Also a very, very important point, the access to land, the ownership of land and of resources, absolutely. And I think you also touched upon an important topic of where to start, right? And this is the moment where I want to remind everybody who's, for example, who's tuning in here from Germany. Germany, as the fourth largest voting power in the IMF and the World Bank, right? They received a massive debt relief in 1953 after World War II, where more than 50% of their debts that they accumulated from before, during, and after World War II were relieved. And that is the basis for their so-called economic miracle, right? And Sri Lanka, and back in the time still called Ceylon, was part of the signatories of this London Agreement. So where to start? Well, Germany could start by cancelling the debts of the countries that enabled its own economic miracle by a starting point of doing justice to the topic. But I want to give Bhumika the last word for this and give you the floor for your synthesis for a new NIEO 2.0 for the 21st century. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Louise. Absolutely agree with my fellow speakers. Breaking the chains of debt colonialism is inherently connected to monetary sovereignty and the currency hegemony. When we're speaking about debt colonialism, we need to bring up the fact that debt is rooted in the colonial legacy of the creation of debt systematically through the centuries of colonialism, but in particular, the ways in which so many colonies really started as independent nations with saddled in debt, whether they were being imposed debt for their own, independence, for the military expenditures of the colonizers during World War I and World War II. Much of the military expenditure of the United Kingdom was put on India's balance of payments ledger. So you have a long history of debt colonialism and, of course, the structural disarticulation of the South. Now, debt restructuring architecture, a huge conversation for the last, 3-4 decades. And we need to understand this through a political lens that despite numerous attempts in the General Assembly, there were resolutions passed led by Argentina in 2013 and 15. In fact, after the Asian financial crisis in 1997, a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism was even proposed within the IMF and was promptly shut down by the US Treasury. We need to understand that this is a political intransigence. It's a political refusal, particularly led by the United States, to prevent debt restructuring. We also need to understand that debt in and of itself is absolutely a normal part of raising financing. It's been around for 5,000 years. Our economic anthropologist, our late economic anthropologist, David Graeber, had laid out so well and articulately the long legacy of debt as a part of society. What is unique about debt colonialism is the predatory nature of debt in the global South. And it's this predatory nature of debt that has to be highlighted. So the role of private creditors and lenders that has surged in financial concentration since the 1980s, asset managers, and specifically in banks, the erasure of the separation between investment and deposit banking, their refusal to deliver meaningful haircuts today from Suriname and Zambia. Importantly, I want to mention austerity. We haven't talked about how austerity is linked to debt restructuring, and this needs to be decoupled. So for a new international economic order too, debtors' clubs, alternative sources to financing to enable debt repudiation. Debt repudiation used to happen in the World War II and even pre-World War II era. It's only in recent decade or 2 decades that you don't see sovereign countries repudiate debt. They instead go into debt default with painful restructuring and, of course, structural transformation to underpin that a pathway out of debt colonialism has to be structural, that that prioritizes and advances the ethos of the NIEO in economic, industrial, green, and climate sovereignty. But I wanted to conclude with kind of raising invoking what would a decolonial approach to an NIEO 2.0 look like. And a decolonial approach would, instead of addressing specific proposals, a decolonial approach would address exclusion, hierarchy, erasure, co-optation, and the expansions that happen in neoliberal regimes with every crisis. So I just wanted to conclude by saying that when we talk about governance, voice, and vote, we talk about technology, intellectual property rights, the positioning of the global South and global value chains at the bottom of the value chain. These are methodologies of exclusion. A reparative approach would not simply be a representative inclusion in the IMF board, but genuine sovereignty and autonomy. When we talk about hierarchy, first and foremost, humanity. The hierarchy of humanity is what lays the foundation from a decolonial lens to the hierarchy of currencies, interest rates, political agendas, interests. So the reparative approach to hierarchy is not an idealistic flattening of hierarchies, but a common but differentiated based approach that takes into consideration the historical trajectory, the historical legacy for equity. Right? Erasure. We need to talk about knowledge power, the economic colonialism of the Chicago School of Economics, and the singularity of neoliberalism as an ever-expanding regime through financialization and crises. A reparative approach for reparations would be reviving heterodox economic thinking, the plural disciplines and theories of economics, and the knowledge systems of the South, the epistemologies of the South, ways of knowing, doing, and being, especially of the indigenous. So I just wanted to conclude by really upholding what would a decolonial approach, a decolonial ethos, because we are in a time that really we have so many aggressive onslaughts from every side. We need to come up with a political framework, a visionary framework that takes into account how the economic, the political, the human, and the racial hierarchy of capitalism are all intertwined historically, past to present.
Thank you. What a great last words. Thank you so much, all three of you. Before I'm going to head to the Q&A session, I just want to also take the moment to remind everyone that this is also the moment where you can join the struggle for a united force against debt and for debt cancellation by, for example, writing to Debt for Climate, an email that you want to join at onboarding@debtforclimate.org if you want to join us in this fight by uniting the different struggles, the different movements across the globe for debt justice and liberation. Follow us on social media, follow the news, subscribe to our newsletter on our website, but most importantly, join us when in our next mobilization against the G7 summit, because I think, Bhumika, you touched upon the neoliberal response to the NIEO 2.0, the original one, and one of the responses is actually the formation of the G7. So this year, as we celebrate today, we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the new international economic order, but in June, the G7 will celebrate their 50th anniversary in a completely depoliticized fashion. Also there, we think of the G7 as something that has always been there and that we just continue fighting somehow, and that doesn't have a history, but it does. And this is where the calling their bluff, calling their bullshit comes in, that is so important, because this year's summit, they want to call it the Summit for the Global South, while they are a direct response to the proposal, the new international economic order proposed by the G77, by the Global South, to break out of this financial chains. And now a fascist regime in Italy is saying they want to do this summit for the Global South. So Debt for Climate is mobilizing against this. If you want to join this struggle, let us know. If you want to organize something in your location, let us know, and let's put together our forces to fight for liberation and to abolish these institutions that are maintaining the chains of colonialism to today. So that's it from our part, from our inside part, now, or input part. Now it's your turn, your time to ask our speakers the questions that are burning for you. I see Nico has one. I know that Tess is burning to ask you some questions as well. I'll just read you the one from Julio, from Nico, sorry, to Julio. Nico is asking you, Julio, you talked about the need for a debtors club. Where do you see potential for this South solidarity today, taking into account that already soon after the NIEO frictions in solidarity, frictions in solidarity appeared and were exploited by the North. How can we start to build this solidarity again, and via which institutions? The UN again, question mark. So yes, please, if you want to reply briefly to that question.
Yeah. So we also have to say that today there is a meeting in Havana where people all over the world are talking about similar issues today. I think, of course, places like Cuba are a good place to start, but today there are more revolutionary places than Cuba. We have the Democratic Autonomous Administration of Eastern Syria, also known as Rojava. We have movements for liberation that do not seek the power of the state. So the Zapatista movement has been going on for 30 years in Chiapas. We need to understand that the world has changed. The revolutionary goal of wanting to, get to the state and then changing from within has been proven to not work. So we need to create new institutions. I don't think the UN will in any way help us, because it still has this mandate that was initiated, I think, by Stalin, that only these 5 countries, I forgot like all of them right now, but probably US, China, Russia, UK, and probably France, I don't know, are the ones that have veto power, essentially. So it's not a place where we can make demands because they have veto power. The WTO is the same. So we really need forms of direct action as a way to change the relationships of debt that we have today. And so we need to create new institutions, basically counter institutions, democratic institutions.
Thank you, Julio. And then see 2 more hands up. Now just the order changed. So Tess, you can go first.
Thank you so much, Louise. And thank you so much to the brilliant speakers. Really inspirational interventions. I have 2 questions and they're really hard. So I'm really sorry to put this on you. But my first question, I think some of you have already touched on this, but I'd love to know what you think some of the key things we collectively need to do are to reach the realization of an NIEO 2.0, whether that's, creating a global movement again or political education. I'd love to know what your answers to that question are. And secondly, this is even harder, but because you're also inspirational, I'm hoping you might have some kind of creative visions for us of, if we realize an NIEO 2.0 and a world where we've created just systems and structures, what does that look like? What does the world look like when we're not fighting against oppression anymore? Thank you.
Thank you, Tess. Who would like to take on that big question, or those big questions? Who wants to go first? Or do you want us to collect some more questions so we can buy you time to think? Yeah. Okay, then let's have a second question or a third question. Charit, please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thanks for organizing this session. Very interesting. I think there was this conversation about solidarity between the global South. Now, I think Swastika explained quite nicely that if you take the global South, which includes Sri Lanka, the government there is certainly not a progressive government. And you have the same situation in many of the countries in the global South. So the real challenge is we sort of conveniently put the word global South, but how do you still do this when you have so many politically connected people who are supporting the neoliberal system there, which is placing obstacles to any progressive stuff that needs to come from the global South. The question is, challenge is, do you need civil society and trade union and stuff working across these borders to work together, and also join forces with the more oppressed people in the global North as well. So it's not just the global South, it's all people across these countries have to somehow get together. So I think the challenge is huge, actually.
Thank you.
Breakthrough, yeah.
And again, also a reminder that this is actually exactly the challenge that we're trying to take on as Debt for Climate, to unite movements across the globe, between global North and South, across sectors as well. So if you want to join that effort and help pushing up the stone, pushing up the mountain, then please join us. I see one other question from Elisa in the chat, and then maybe we can take a round of responses before we go to the next questions. What would be your thoughts on how a NIEO would look like regarding official development assistance, financial quote unquote aid, especially climate finance, and breaking unequal exchange relationships? So maybe I'm gonna give you a break. I know these are very, very, very big questions, and maybe you just need a second to breathe before you ordered your thoughts. So that's also fine. We have a lot of time left. So order your thoughts, and when you feel ready, maybe you can just share what you think from these questions.
Maybe if you just quickly, I don't want to take too much space here, but we have to remember that there is also a South in the North, right? So, for example, in the US, the struggles for Black liberation and abolitionism are asking for the total abolition of the prison system. The prison system is tied directly to the financial system, the monetary system. There cannot be paid police, there cannot be paid army people, unless there is a system of taxation that, basically takes people's surplus labor in the form of money and then funds the mechanism of the state. This is known as the military coinage slavery complex. And so if, we don't change that link, we cannot change the world, let's say. And so connecting with struggles for abolition in the US to, for example, struggles for debt cancellation in places like Sri Lanka, land struggles in places like Brazil, these are all interconnected issues. The issues for extractivism of things like lithium in Chile and many other countries. These are all interconnected parts of the same structure that we're fighting. And so I think understanding what is our and what are the institutions that we need to abolish so that this enemy can fall, so that our adversary can be defeated. I think this is the question that we have to do. And through that process, uniting the struggles. As you said, we cannot rely on the politicians of our nation states to do the job because they are part of an international class that basically just, is just looking after themselves, essentially. And so we really need to connect the social movements that are fighting for all these intersectional struggles as a way to reach our goal. And debt cancellation, to me, is a way to connect them.
Thank you. Bhumika, you have unmuted yourself. Does this mean you want to take it on?
Sure. Yes, this is absolutely the key issue. This inherent tension of the internal colonialism as the phenomenon occurring across the global South. Yeah. So let me go back to the critiques, the shortcomings of the new international economic order. One of the critics actually was Samir Amin, a Marxist dependency theorist, who had actually argued that one of the key challenges to actualizing the NIEO was the post-colonial bourgeoisie, or the political and economic elites that were sitting in the leadership of many newly formed independent states. And we see this as really having been taken a turn after the neoliberal counter-revolution, where the United States led so many coups across developing countries from Chile to Indonesia, putting in place military dictatorships that furthered the neo-colonial linkage between former colonizers and former colonies. So the ways in which this internal colonialism has been reproducing and replicating the mechanisms, techniques, and then effects of inequality within developing countries, as had been done on the colonial scale, has now created a sort of, a world system in which you have layers of the same sort of exploitation, one happening internationally between countries or between rich and poor countries, and then within developing countries, which is now homogenous and extremely now heterogeneous and increasingly divided between powerful developing countries, especially the BRICS, and the vast majority of developing countries, especially between middle income and low income, as arbitrary and colonial as these categories are. So these political and economic schisms or fissures, the tensions between developing nations are really at the core. And so in this, you know, I would echo my fellow speaker Julio by pointing to the solidarity that is required between the working class and between movements of the North and the South. And we see this through history, right? Through first of all, let's go back to the history of freedom movements. We see in the freedom movements how the working class of the United Kingdom was supporting the freedom movement of India, for example. We see this with South African apartheid, with civil rights movement, where the civil rights movement in the United States was supported by African nations and other developing countries. We see it right now today with the university students across the United States really putting it out there that the social movements of and the trade unions in the United States as well, that the liberation of Palestine, the end to the colonial war and genocide is imperative. So linking the North and South movements, and then solidarity and linkaging that is effective and sustained between our different movements, between climate, feminist, reproductive justice, economic justice, anti-austerity, debt justice. All these movements really need to come together and understand that yes, they have different forums and venues and tactics, but essentially we need to do such a wide scale movement of movements is necessary. So I think the solidarity and linkaging requires a strategic approach that forges the linkages, forges relationships. These, linking movements and creating solidarity is about relationships. It's about building trust. It's about creating an environment of relational equality. So I think, first and foremost, we need to create the spaces, but also demand the spaces from many of the funders of social movements and civil society organizations that keep the focus on doing advocacy to the centers of power, rather than building the internal strategy, political education, and the movements. This is a critical time right now because especially the student activism in so many countries is at a peak. Worker activism with so much of the global South under the subjugation of austerity. Sri Lanka is in full power. This is a key time, and especially the political visibility and momentum that the climate justice movement has, Future for Fridays, the youth, the climate youth activists can be galvanized into creating, being leaders of creating this solidarity, since, they already have such a vast global network of campaigners. So these are just some examples that come to mind, but I cannot stress the need for solidarity. I think the magic happens with the solidarity. And last but not least, the debtors clubs. There is momentum happening on forging debtors clubs. And one of the key conversations is about how to create solidarity between developing countries, even if it's a small number of developing countries, and to look strategically at alternative sources of financing that can enable debt repudiation and and economic sovereignty.
Thank you, Bhumika. Swastika, do you wanna take the floor?
Yeah, I just wanted to perhaps catch on to the phrase which Bhumika used or quoted from Samir Ali about the post-colonial bourgeoisie. And the reason why I'm interested in that phrase is 2 years ago in Sri Lanka, 1 million people came to the capital city of Colombo. This was not an organized protest. It was a spontaneous uprising of people. And their simple demand was that they wanted the president to resign, because the president's family in Sri Lanka has, after decades of acute corruption, has bankrupted the country. So when Bhumika was talking about the phrase, or which was referring to the phrase post-colonial bourgeoisie, in every country, we are struggling not only with neo-colonial structures and oppression which comes through that, but we're also struggling and fighting against our own bourgeoisie, our own elite, our own business and political elite, who don't mind dispossessing millions of people in every country in order for their own survival. And even today in Sri Lanka, even when we are going through this severe economic crisis, you find the business class bargaining on the wages of workers, bargaining to depress the wages of workers so that they can keep some more dollars in their offshore accounts and so on. So in answering that question about how do you imagine building this solidarity or building this 2.0 NEO? What I would say is the first NEO was about states coming and demanding, governments coming and demanding for a new economic order. But today we don't have governments which are representing the masses, the large masses. Governments, for instance, the Sri Lankan government, the Indian government, do not represent the working class. They represent the elite. So we can't expect them to come and forge a new international economic order. But we do have a vibrant reaction or a massive reaction to what the governments have been doing. We are having workers' movement. Look at the resistance which has come from students and not so much from workers, unfortunately, but mostly from students in terms of against the Palestinian genocide. So this is not something, when we look at it, we don't take it lightly. We see this, we see international solidarity happening almost spontaneously. And that is what we need in terms of the workers' movement. Also, there was also a question asked, what would be a world when there is an actual new international economic order in place? And one of the things which I can imagine is that, I don't know what that word would be, maybe less wars and so on, but one of the things which I can for sure say is that the world will be, we can sustain the globe, we can sustain the ecosystem and the environment for humans to survive. I mean, we are humans, we are a tiny part of this ecosystem. And the new international economic order would create structures whereby the globe, the world can survive perhaps a few more decades. But if we keep going at this rate, I don't think we have a future for human survival. And after all, we are talking about human survival. I mean, the world, the globe will go on despite whether we have humans or not. So we're also talking about a survival, and that is what the current capitalist order is missing. There is an imagination that somehow the world will survive, somehow humans will survive, somehow we will survive at the expense of thousands and thousands of workers. And I think the new international economic order, if such an order comes into place, will come from international workers' movement, working class movement, peasants' movements, fishers' movements, student movements, and it will not come from it will not come automatically from the governments which we're having right now, which is very much a representation of this post-colonial bourgeoisie, which Samir Ali was referring to. Thank you.
Thank you so much. With a quick glance at the time, I think maybe we can take one more question, one more answer, and then we have to wrap it up. So Hamidou, if you want to, go ahead.
I want to thank all the speakers. I'm a Sierra Leonean presently living in the US. My question is just in regards to how we can able to, because the problem is not really the leadership, it's with the ordinary people. Because if you look now, the protest that is going on in all campuses in the US is being curtailed by the ordinary people, which we call the security apparatus. So my question is, how are we going to include those people and find a way how we can able to sensitize the security apparatus? Because it's hard to see a security personnel that is a millionaire or a billionaire. They are all just ordinary working class, but they are using the working class against the working class. So how are we going to find a solution to bridge that gap between the two working class? Because if we can have a society that the working class, the security apparatus knows that they are just being used as a tool against their also working class, how are we going to solve that problem? Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know how long your question is, Elaine. If you want to, and it's a brief one, you can also quickly go to it, and we see if we can reply to both at the same time.
Hey, thanks so much. I am so inspired by great class analysis and call for a movement of movements. So many other calls here. One word that I don't think I heard were corporations, and I feel like there was a lot of talk about trying to, overthrow, if you will, the political class, the bourgeoisie. But they are just the superstructure reporting or bossed by corporations who give them their marching orders. And I always wonder, how can any of our movements, our movement of movement, actually reach these absolutely, powerful corporations? How can we get rid of them to change the architecture? Thanks.
More question. I think one of the speakers actually, I think Bhumika mentioned corporations, the role of corporations addressed by the original NIEO, and definitely something that we need to look into. Right. So if any of the speakers feel comfortable and confident to maybe take 2 minutes or so to reply to one or both questions, then feel free to take the floor. Go ahead.
Maybe Swasthika. I would answer to the first question. One of the things which we don't speak enough with the working class, and that is why working class is always pitted against the working class, right? One of the things we don't speak enough about within the working class is the divisions, is the race divisions, the caste divisions, particularly in South Asian countries, the caste divisions, gender identity issues, gender issues, and so on. And if we don't speak about those, I mean, of course, some of the leaders, they make progressive speeches and so on. But if we do not have a systemic structure to continuously educate workers on these identities, on the politics which come of these identities, and not always in a negative way. Anti-race struggles have always been part and parcel of the working class movement. So I think if we have, which I am kind of seeing this in my country, if we have consistent structures to continuously educate workers, the working class, without seeing them as passive observers of what the union leaders are doing in terms of activism and progressive activism, I think part of this issue where workers are pitted against workers will be resolved, because ultimately the pitting, we are able to pit one against each other because workers do not properly understand or made to understand what are the structures which are keeping certain workers at a particular level and certain workers at a different level and so on. For instance, this whole issue of the Sri Lankan workers being exported to Israel, and I use the word export because that is exactly what the government is doing, in order to take the space of the Palestinian workers where they have been denied work permits inside Israel. So before our union federation released that statement, we had a discussion with workers and said why it's important for Sri Lankan workers to stand against the dispossession of Palestinian workers, despite the fact that we need jobs in our country as well, because we are going through an economic crisis. And once we have a serious discussion with workers, it's not something which is impossible to create that change, or to make it impossible rather of states and the bourgeoisie to pit workers against workers. Of course, I spoke of a very small, tiny example, but I think workers' education, and I have been speaking to Bhumika at length about it, it's very important if we have to overcome this issue. Thank you.
Thanks. Bhumika, if you want to have the last word, you have about 1 minute to do so.
Oh, thank you. I just really wanted to spotlight both Elaine and Patrick. Let me just quickly address, Elaine, absolutely, corporations are at the very center, and of course, the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, intellectual property rights. We have so many manifold legal regimes to protect investors. We see this: protect investors, protect corporations, protect transnational money flows and resource and trade and production control. Corporate power, as a whole, corporate power cannot be separated, disconnected from the from the nation state from the nation state. But at the same time, we know that transnational corporate power is able to control governments. We see this definitely in the BRICS nations, where you have the rise of these huge multinational corporations that are increasingly, and the line between public and private is blurred in many BRIC countries, as we know. Many powerful countries, in the United States Congress, you have the influence of transnational corporations. So I think that we need to come back to the fact that,
to wrap it up, just Bhumika, because
yeah,
we're hitting 30.
Just to address Elaine's, one of the things is shareholder activism. That what we have with corporate power is that the maximizing of investor profits is based on the shareholder value model, and maximizing that shareholder activism. And just to address, at least give mention to Patrick Bond's, that we need to also talk about delinking that was proposed by people like Samira Amin. So that kind of delinking that is required by that would address that national bourgeoisie that Swastika also, of course, highlighted. So thank you so much for this wonderful webinar, and I leave it to you for the closing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been a very, very exciting discussion. Thanks a lot for the valuable questions and inputs. And let's see this really as the beginning of the new phase of campaigning, of movements, where we can, come together. And it's up to us to build this movement of movements that we say we need, right? We're here, we're organizers, we're spread across the globe. So if everybody, all of the 50 participants in this webinar, and I don't know how many are in the live streams, we all come together. We are already many people still. So please join us. Let's build this together. And I really want to take 1 second to thank the interpreters for their amazing work that they did today. If you want to, you can put on your cameras. If you don't want to be on camera, you can also leave it off. But I want to thank Camilo and Rogelia. I want to thank Patricia, and I want to thank Lilou for their great work today as interpreters. Our webinars could not work without you, and our global calls could not work without your work. So thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for joining the webinar today. We will upload it as soon as we have organized the download, and then we look very much forward to initiating this campaign around the NIEO and continue building our movement of movements on debt cancellation together with all of you. So again, solidarity on this very historic day. Thanks for showing up. Thank you for sharing it, and good luck to everybody in your fights. Let's stick together. See you all.